Act 1. The Ancient Backbone. Go ahead, now. Let yourself settle in. Find a comfortable place, let your shoulders drop, let your hands go heavy. There's nowhere you need to be tonight, nowhere at all. Just here, in the quiet, with a story worth telling slowly. Imagine, if you will, a fire. Not a big roaring one, just a small, steady fire. The kind that burns low and warm, casting soft, orange light on the ground around it. The kind that makes the world feel smaller, safer, close. You can hear it breathing, a soft crackle here, a gentle pop there, and then long stretches of nothing but the sound of the night settling in around you. And beyond the firelight, just barely visible in the dark, are the mountains. They've always been there, long before you arrived, long before anyone arrived, really. And tonight, we're going to sit with them for a while, quietly, without any hurry, and let them tell us a little bit about who they are. These are the Smoky Mountains, and their story begins so far back in time that the numbers almost stop meaning anything at all. The Appalachian Mountains and the Smokies are part of this great, ancient chain, are among the oldest mountains on the face of the earth. We're talking about over 200 million years of age. 200 million years. The dinosaurs hadn't even arrived yet when these mountains were already old. The Atlantic Ocean as we know it today didn't exist. The continents themselves were still pressed together in one great landmass, slowly beginning to drift apart. And yet, here were the Appalachians, already standing, already rising, already watching. Of course, they looked very different then. In their younger days, geologists believe these mountains may have been something like the Alps or the Himalayas, jagged, dramatic peaks thrusting up into a sky that no human eye would ever see. But time has a way of softening things. Rain and wind and the slow creep of ice over millennia. It all wears away the sharp edges, rounds the ridges, deepens the valleys. What we see today in the Smokies is a range that has been patient, a range that has allowed itself to be shaped. And the result is something that feels somehow more ancient than something dramatic, more settled, more wise. There's a quality to old mountains that younger ones don't quite have yet. They feel like they've made peace with something. A great deal of what makes up the rock beneath your feet in the Smokies is sedimentary in origin, meaning it began long ages ago, not as mountain at all, but as the floor of an ancient sea. Layers upon layers of sediment built up over millions of years as tiny particles drifted down through still water and came to rest, one on top of another, slowly pressing together under their own enormous weight until they hardened into stone. Think about that for a moment as you settle deeper into wherever you are right now. The mountains beneath your feet, if you were there, were once the bottom of an ocean. Creatures swam above them. The sun filtered down through fathoms of water and cast pale, wavering light on the very rock that would one day become a ridge you could hike along on a cool autumn morning, watching mist curl up from the hollows below. Tectonic forces, the slow, grinding movement of the Earth's great plates, eventually pushed all of that ancient seafloor upward, folded it, bent it, crumpled it, the way you might crumple a piece of paper between your palms. And what had been flat and horizontal, layered like pages in a book, became tilted and buckled, shaped into the long, rolling ridges and valleys that give the Appalachians their characteristic look. That gentle, rhythmic undulation, ridge after ridge after ridge, fading blue into the distance. The highest point in all of this ancient landscape is a place called Klingman's Dome. It rises to 6,643 feet above sea level, which, if you're not used to thinking in those terms, is well over a mile in the air. On a clear day from the observation tower at the summit, you can see for 100 miles in every direction. You can watch weather systems forming and moving across the landscape below you. You can see, on certain winter mornings, a sea of clouds filling the valleys while you stand above them in cold sunshine, looking out over what appears to be an endless white ocean. But Clingman's Dome is not alone in its height. In fact, the Smokies are remarkably tall for mountains of their age. 16 separate peaks in the park rise above 6,000 feet. 16. That's an extraordinary concentration of elevation for a range that has been slowly, gently eroding for hundreds of millions of years. It speaks to just how tall these mountains once must have been, that even after all this time, after all that weathering, they still stand this high. There's something reassuring about that, somehow. Something that speaks to a kind of deep, quiet endurance. All of that elevation does something remarkable to the weather in the Smokies. The mountains essentially create their own climate. As warm, moist air flows in from the Gulf of Mexico and rises up the slopes, it cools and condenses. It becomes clouds. It becomes rain. It becomes that legendary mist that hangs in the hollows and gives these mountains their name. The Cherokee people called this place Shakonage, which translates, roughly, as Land of Blue Smoke. And on most any morning of the year, you can see exactly why. The higher elevations of the park receive, on average, around 85 inches of rain each year. 85 inches. For comparison, Seattle, a city famous for its rain, gets about 37. The Smokies get more than twice that, high up on the ridgelines, and in winter, those same elevations can receive roughly 69 inches of snow. The peaks are often hidden under it. The high trails disappear beneath it for months at a time. All of that water, all that rain, all that snowmelt is what feeds the extraordinary lushness you see in every photograph of this place. That deep, saturated green, those rhododendron thickets, so dense and tangled they create tunnels, those waterfalls that appear around almost every bend in the trail. The water is constant here. It is everywhere. It is the lifeblood of everything that grows. And there is so very much that grows here. So very much to explore. The trail network in Great Smoky Mountains National Park stretches to 850 miles. 850 miles of paths winding through old-growth forest, scrambling over exposed ridges, dipping down into misty coves, crossing and recrossing the streams that lace through every valley. Among those trails, 70 miles belong to the Appalachian Trail itself, that famous footpath that runs all the way from Georgia to Maine and that passes right through the heart of this park along the high ridgeline, and threading through all of it, feeding every root and stone and hollow, are 2,115 miles of streams. More than 2,000 miles of moving water, murmuring and rushing and trickling through the landscape. Cold mountain streams where brook trout still swim in water, so clear you can see every pebble on the bottom. Wide, rocky shoals where the water braids itself into a dozen channels. Quiet, moss-edged pools beneath small falls, still as a held breath. The park is, in many ways, a living watershed. Everything in it is connected by water. So as you lie there tonight, wherever you are, in a warm bed or curled up on a couch, or drifting somewhere comfortable and quiet, let the mountains settle into your mind. 200 million years of patience, ancient seafloors pushed up into the sky, 16 peaks still standing above 6,000 feet after all this time, after all this rain, after everything. Trails enough to walk for weeks without retracing your steps, and always, always, the sound of water somewhere close by. The Smokies have been here a very long time, and they are in no hurry at all. Neither are we. Let the image of those peaks fade slowly now, those long, blue ridges disappearing one behind the other into the haze. The mountains are still there. They'll be there when you wake. But for now, let your mind ease down from the high places and drift gently into the forest below. Because as ancient and remarkable as the stone beneath the Smokies is, it is what grows up from that stone that truly takes your breath away. The trees here, the wildflowers, the mosses and ferns and fungi, the sheer, almost impossible variety of living things that has found a home in this place over all these millions of years. That's where we're headed next, into the green. Act 2. Before the park, people and place. The forest floor in the Smokies is soft underfoot. Not soft the way a manicured lawn is soft, but soft the way old things get soft. The way a well-worn book feels in your hands, or a path that has been walked so many times the earth has yielded to it, accepted it, made a place for it. Decades of fallen leaves have pressed themselves into the ground here. Decades of rain have worked them slowly downward into something dark and rich and quiet. You walk on layer after layer of the past, and the trees rise up around you from all of it, rooted deep in everything that came before. And that, in a way, is true of the whole place. Because the Smoky Mountains are not just a landscape made of stone and water and old green growing things. They are a landscape made of people too, of thousands of years of human lives lived in these hollows, along these streams, on these hillsides, of stories that go so far back they are woven into the rock itself, and of other stories, more recent ones, that are written in the weathered wood of old buildings still standing in the mist. Tonight, we're going to sit with some of those stories. We're going to let them come to us slowly, the way the best stories always do. Long before a single European foot touched these mountains, long before anyone drew a line on a map and gave this place a name in any language but one, the Smokies were home. They were home to the Cherokee people. The Cherokee called themselves Anyunwiya, the principal people. And for centuries beyond easy counting, these mountains were the center of their world. Not just a hunting ground or a seasonal camp, but a homeland in the deepest sense of that word. A place woven through with memory and meaning and spiritual significance. The peaks had names. The rivers had stories, the plants had purposes that had been learned and passed down over countless generations, each person adding to the knowledge, refining it, handing it forward. The Cherokee were not visitors here. They were of this place. They understood it the way you understand a language you grew up speaking, not as a set of rules to be learned and applied, but as something that lives inside you. Something you think in, something you dream in. Their towns dotted the river valleys. They cultivated the land along the bottomlands, where the soil was richest, growing corn and beans and squash. The Three Sisters, as many southeastern peoples called them, because they support each other when planted together, the corn providing a stalk for the beans to climb. The beans fixing nitrogen in the soil, the squash spreading its broad leaves along the ground to hold in moisture and crowd out weeds. A whole system of mutual care, quietly worked out over generations. And then, in the 18th and 19th centuries, The world the Cherokee had built here began to fracture. European settlers moved into the mountain valleys, treaties were made and broken. The pressure grew and grew and grew until in 1838 came what the Cherokee call Nunadol Tsuni, the trail where they cried. Thousands of Cherokee were forcibly removed from their homelands and marched west to Indian Territory in present-day Oklahoma. Thousands died along the way. Some Cherokee hid in these mountains. They refused to go, and their descendants, the Eastern Band of Cherokee Indians, remain in this region to this day, with their capital at Cherokee, North Carolina, just outside the park boundary. The mountains did not forget them, and they have not forgotten the mountains. When you walk through the Smokies, you walk through their homeland still. That is worth holding gently in your mind. By the time the park was formally established in 1934, European American settlers had been living in these mountains for well over a century. Small farming communities had taken root in the coves and hollows, those sheltered, flat-bottomed valleys carved out between the ridges where the soil was deep and the streams ran clear and cold, and there was enough sun, even deep in the mountains, to grow a garden and keep a few animals through the summer. They built cabins from the chestnut and oak and tulip poplar that grew thick around them. They raised barns and built mills. They established small churches where the community gathered on Sundays, the only day the work paused long enough to breathe. They buried their dead in family cemeteries on gentle hillsides and marked the graves with stones, some carved with names and dates, others plain and anonymous, the identity of whoever lies beneath them long since lost to time. When the land was acquired to create the park, those communities were displaced. The families moved out, the farms left behind. It was, for many, a painful uprooting, not entirely unlike the one that had come before. People had been born in those cabins, had grown up running through those fields, had carried water from those streams their whole lives. To leave was not a small thing, but many of the buildings stayed. Today, Great Smoky Mountains National Park preserves more than 90 historic structures, cabins, barns, smokehouses, churches, mills, and more. More than 90. It is, in fact, one of the finest collections of preserved Appalachian mountain structures anywhere in the country. Walking through certain parts of the park, you can step into buildings that have stood for 150 years, their log walls chinked with mud and moss, their wooden floors worn smooth by the generations of feet that crossed them every single day. The most famous of these preserved landscapes is Cades Cove, a broad, open valley ringed by forested ridges where white-tailed deer graze in the fields in the early morning light, and old homesteads sit in the mist like memories. In Cades Cove and scattered across the park, some of these old structures are more than just beautiful ruins. Some of them still work. The Ogle Tub Mill is one of those places. A tub mill is a simple, elegant piece of machinery, the kind of design that works so well it barely changes over centuries. Water is directed through a flume, a narrow wooden channel, and drops down onto a horizontal wheel fitted with angled paddles. The falling water strikes the paddles and the wheel turns. The wheel is connected directly to a millstone above it, and the millstone turns too. And between the millstone and a fixed stone beneath it, corn is ground. Slowly, steadily, grain by grain, the hard, dried kernels are reduced to meal. Cornmeal was not a convenience for mountain families, it was a staple. Cornbread, corn porridge, corn mush. Corn was the foundation of the diet. A working mill was as essential to a community as the water that powered it, and so these small tub mills appeared wherever there was a reliable stream with enough fall to turn a wheel. They were individual or family operations, not the grand commercial mills of the lowlands. Personal, intimate. A man might walk a mile down a trail with a sack of dried corn on his shoulder and return home an hour later with meal enough to feed his family for a week. The Ogletub mill still grinds cornmeal today. The water still falls. The wheel still turns. The stone still moves in its ancient, patient circle. There is something quietly extraordinary about standing near a machine that old and watching it do exactly what it was built to do, not as a demonstration, not as a performance, but simply because it still can. Further into the park, near the Madron Bald Trail, the forest holds another remnant of the life that once filled these mountains. The Tyson McCarter farmstead dates to the 1870s, a working farm established by a family who made their life on this land through what must have been equal parts determination and ingenuity. What remains of the farmstead includes something you don't see very often: the outline of a circular farm layout, a design practical in ways that aren't immediately obvious until you think about them. With a circular arrangement, the farmhouse sits at the center, and the outbuildings, barn, smokehouse, corn crib, radiate outward like spokes from a hub. You can see everything from everywhere. You waste no steps. There is an efficiency to it, a quiet intelligence that you recognize when someone explains it, but that the person who designed it simply felt through years of working the land and learning what worked and what didn't. The barn on the McCarter farmstead was built with a drive-through passage, a wide central aisle open at both ends so that a wagon loaded with hay could pull in from one side and out the other without turning around. It was also, in an era when wolves and bears were real concerns, a design that kept the animals safer. The barn itself was the protection. Pull the animals in, close the doors, and whatever was out there in the dark stayed out, standing near the ruins of that old barn today in the shade of trees that have grown up around it. It is easy to feel the weight of the life that was lived there. The early mornings, the long days, the way the mountain seasons dictated everything: when to plant, when to harvest, when to put food by for winter, when to rest. And then there is the story of what almost happened to Cades Cove, and didn't. In the 1930s, when the park was still newly established and the future of the land was still being decided, there were planners who looked at that broad, beautiful valley and saw something other than open meadows and old homesteads. They saw a reservoir. They saw a lake. They proposed damming the stream that drains the cove, flooding the valley floor, and developing the resulting lake into a marina for recreational boating. A marina in what is now one of the most beloved and visited natural landscapes in the entire eastern United States. It sounds almost impossible now, but it was a genuine proposal, seriously considered at a time when dam building was fashionable and the full value of wild, intact landscapes was not yet widely understood in the way it is today. The idea had its supporters. It very nearly went forward, but it didn't. Conservationists and park advocates pushed back. They argued that the valley's open meadows, its historic structures, its wildlife, its extraordinary ecological and historical character were worth more intact than flooded. They won the argument. The dam was never built. The valley stayed dry. The deer still graze where the lake would have been. The old churches still stand in the morning mist. The meadows are still there. It is one of those quiet moments in history that most people never hear about, A decision made in a small room somewhere by people who cared enough to fight for something they believed in, that preserved a place of irreplaceable beauty for every person who has walked that valley road since. Every deer you might see grazing in Cade's Cove on a cool morning. Every child who has pressed their face against the old cabin glass and wondered about the people who lived inside. Every photographer who has waited for the light to come right over the ridge. All of it exists because someone once said no. The mountains hold all of this, the Cherokee names still whispered in the streams, the worn thresholds of old cabins, the millstones still turning, the circular farms still visible in the arrangement of weathered wood. The valley that was almost a lake and isn't. History doesn't always announce itself loudly. Sometimes it just sits quietly, like an old building in the mist, waiting for someone to come along and notice. Let these stories settle with you now. Let them drift downward, the way leaves drift to the floor of a still forest, slow and weightless, and finally at rest. But the Smokies aren't only a place of human history. They are also, and perhaps above all else, a place of extraordinary life, of a biodiversity so remarkable that scientists come from all over the world to study it, to count it, to try to understand how so many living things have come to exist in one place. The forests here are ancient and complex, beyond imagining. And in the next stretch of our evening, we're going to wander into them, quietly, without startling anything, and see what lives there. Act 3. Logging Era to Preservation. There is a particular quality to old-growth forest that is very hard to describe to someone who hasn't stood inside one. It isn't just the size of the trees, though the size is staggering. It isn't just the silence, though the silence is deep and layered in a way that feels almost physical, like something you could reach out and touch. It's something more than either of those things. It's a feeling of complexity, of age, of a system so intricate and so long established that you, standing in the middle of it, are only the very smallest part of what is happening there. The fungi threading through the soil beneath your feet, the insects moving through the bark of a fallen log, the moss absorbing water from air that is already heavy with moisture, everything connected, everything in conversation with everything else in a language far older and far more patient than anything we speak. The Smokies still have some of that old-growth forest. About a quarter of the park, roughly 100,000 acres, has never been logged. But the reason that number is a quarter, and not the whole, is a story we need to sit with tonight. A story about what was almost lost here, and about the people who decided it was worth fighting to save what remained. In the decades following the Civil War, as the industrial appetite of a growing nation turned its attention toward the resources of the southern Appalachians, the forests of the Smokies became a target. The trees here were extraordinary, tulip poplars 6 and 7 feet across, chestnuts so large that a grown man couldn't reach his arms around them, hemlocks and white pines rising straight and tall as cathedral columns for 100 feet before the first branch. Old-growth timber of a quality that the lowlands, long since stripped of their own great forests, could no longer provide. And so the timber companies came. They came with money and with equipment and with a particular kind of determination that doesn't much pause to consider what it's taking. The late 1800s and early 1900s saw the most intensive period of logging in the history of these mountains, a period during which vast tracts of forest were cut, hillside after hillside stripped bare, the great trees felled and hauled away and fed into the mills that had sprung up at the edges of the wilderness. Getting the timber out was the central engineering challenge. The mountains were steep. The valleys were narrow. The roads, such as they were, couldn't carry the weight of logs on the scale that was needed. And so the timber companies built railroads. They pushed narrow-gauge tracks up into hollows that had never seen anything but foot traffic and mule paths. They blasted through ridges, filled in creek beds, and laid iron rails up grades so steep that the locomotives strained at every yard. The sound of those trains, the grinding of steel wheels on steel rail, the screaming of the whistle echoing off the valley walls, the hiss of steam, must have been absolutely startling in a landscape that had known only the wind and the water and the birds. The trees came down, the logs rolled onto the flat cars, the trains hauled them out, and the mountainsides were left raw and open to the sky, the soil exposed, the streams running dark with runoff, the ancient complexity of the forest reduced in the span of a few years to stumps and slash and silence of a very different kind. Along Injun Creek, deep in the park, the forest has grown back around a piece of that era that never quite made it out, scattered along the creek bank, half buried in decades of leaf litter and moss, partially swallowed by the roots of trees that have grown up around and through it, lies the wreckage of a 1920s logging steam engine. Boilerplate and wheel fragments and rusted iron fittings lying where they came to rest when the engine finally gave out, or when the operation ended and nobody thought it worth the trouble of hauling the old machine back out. The creek's name, Injun Creek, is itself a small piece of accidental history. The story goes that it's a corruption, a misspelling on an old map of the word engine. Engine Creek, named for machinery like this very wreck. Somewhere along the way, a mapmaker misread the handwriting or misheard the name and wrote it down wrong. And the wrong name stuck, the way wrong names sometimes do, until it became the name everyone knew. The engine lies there still. The creek moves around it and over it and through it. In spring, wildflowers come up between the rusted pieces. In summer, the forest closes in, and the whole wreck disappears almost entirely into the green. In winter, when the leaves are down and the light comes through at a low angle, you can see the shapes of the old machine more clearly. The curves of the iron, the size of it, the suggestion of what it once was. There is something unexpectedly moving about it, a machine that once made such noise, lying now in such perfect quiet. Further along the little river drainage, the logging era left behind something even more extensive, a whole community, now abandoned, slowly being reclaimed by the forest. The Little River Lumber Company was one of the largest timber operations in the region. At its peak, it employed hundreds of men and operated dozens of miles of railroad track, pushing deep into the mountains. The community that grew up around its operations in a place called Elkmont eventually evolved beyond just a logging camp. As the timber operation wound down and the land began to be acquired for the park, some of the buildings were converted into vacation cottages. A summer retreat grew up where the lumber company had been. For decades, those cottages were leased to private families who came back summer after summer, generation after generation, filling the old cabins with the particular rituals and habits of families who return to the same beloved place every year. The smell of the same wood in the same walls, the same view from the same porch, the same sound of the little river just through the trees. But eventually, the leases ended, the families left, and Elkmont became a ghost town. Today, it is one of the most quietly haunting places in the park. The cabins still stand, some of them anyway, their porches sagging, their windows dark, their gardens long since gone back to forest. Mossy steps lead up to doors that don't open anymore. Chimneys rise from collapsed roof lines. Old stone foundations hold nothing but air and ferns, and the occasional confused deer, picking its way through what was once someone's living room. The forest is patient. It has been working on Elkmont for decades now, and it is making slow, steady progress. But for the moment, the human story of the place is still visible, still present in the shapes of the buildings, in the arrangement of the old lots, in the faint suggestion of a road that once ran through here, carrying families toward somewhere they loved. It is a place that asks you gently to think about the things we build and how long they last, and about the forest, always the forest, waiting quietly at every edge. It was the forest itself, a single, specific, blazing moment of it that helped start the movement to protect all of this. In 1924, a botanist named Harlan P. Kelsey made his way to a place in the Smokies called Gregory Bald. A bald is one of the park's distinctive features, a grassy or shrubby opening near a mountaintop, treeless for reasons that are still not entirely understood, sitting up on the ridge like a clearing made by someone who wanted to give the mountains a window. And Gregory Bald in late spring is covered in flame azaleas. If you have never seen a flame azalea in full bloom, the name gives you some idea, but not quite enough. They are extraordinary. Masses of blossoms in shades that run from pale yellow through orange and deep coral and vivid red, sometimes all of those colors on the same hillside, sometimes on the same plant. In early June, Gregory Bald becomes a place of almost theatrical beauty. The color seems to vibrate against the blue sky and the green of the surrounding forest. It stops people in their tracks. It has been stopping people in their tracks for as long as anyone has been climbing up to see it. It stopped Harlan Kelsey. He came down from that mountain with a conviction that had been forming for some time, but that sharpened on that hillside into something clear and urgent. This place had to be protected, not managed, not harvested, protected, preserved as completely as possible from the forces that had already stripped so much of the surrounding landscape. Kelsey became one of the earliest and most vocal advocates for the creation of a national park in the Smokies. His voice joined others, conservationists, writers, local citizens, politicians, in a campaign that would take another decade to fully succeed. But that began, in a real sense, with a man standing on a hillside covered in fire-colored flowers, unwilling to look away. The park that exists today, all 500,000 acres of it, owes something to that moment, to a botanist who went for a walk and saw something so beautiful he couldn't let it go. In the 1930s, as the park was being established and the work of building its infrastructure was underway, a new kind of labor came to the mountains. The Civilian Conservation Corps, the CCC, was one of the great public works programs of the New Deal era. Young men, many of them from cities, many of them out of work and struggling through the Depression, were sent to places like the Smokies to build, to plant, to clear, to construct the roads, the trails, the bridges, the buildings, the infrastructure that would make the park accessible and functional for the generations that came after. They worked hard in conditions that were often difficult. They learned skills they hadn't had. They lived in camps in the mountains, and they left their mark all over the park in the form of stone walls and carefully graded trails and well-made buildings that are still standing today, still in use, still doing exactly what they were built to do. Somewhere beneath Klingman's Dome Road, that winding drive up to the highest point in the park, there is a tunnel. A small, functional tunnel built by CCC hands in the 1930s, originally connected to what was once a mule trail running along the ridge. It is not a famous tunnel. Most visitors drive over it and never know it's there. But it is there, solid and quiet in the dark under the road, another piece of invisible history holding up the present. And then there is Mount Camera. At 5,050 feet, Mount Camera is not the tallest peak in the park. But what sits on its summit is one of the most beloved structures the CCC ever built in the Smokies, a fire lookout tower of such simple and elegant beauty that it has become, for many people, one of their most treasured memories of the park. The tower was built in the 1930s and sits right on the rocky summit of the mountain, its stone base growing naturally out of the ridgeline as though it were always meant to be there. The stonework is careful and fine, the structure is compact and sturdy, and from the windows of the lookout cab, the views stretch out in every direction, ridge after ridge rolling away into the distance, the valleys dark with forest, the sky enormous overhead. For decades, a fire lookout lived up there during the summer months, scanning the horizon for smoke, watching the weather build and break over the mountains, sleeping in the small cabin attached to the tower while the wind moved through the trees on the steep slopes below. It was solitary work. It was, by many accounts, work that drew people who needed the mountains the way other people need other things, who found in the height and the quiet and the long, unbroken views something that nowhere else could give them. The tower is unmanned now, but you can still hike to it, 7 miles roughly, from the nearest trailhead, gaining and losing elevation the whole way, the trail climbing through forest and then out onto the open rocky summit. And when you get there and stand where those long-ago lookouts stood and see what they saw every single day, the mountains in every direction, the sky turning color at the edges, you understand something about why someone would choose that life, and why someone once thought it worth the trouble of building something that beautiful in a place that hard to reach. From the screech of logging trains to the careful stonework of CCC hands, from a botanist standing still on a hillside in wonder to a rusted engine lying quiet under the moss. The Smokies carry all of these layers, all of this human reaching and retreating and returning, and the forest grows over it, not to erase it, but to hold it, to keep it somewhere safe. Let the image of that old fire tower sit with you for a moment, stone on a high ridge, wind, the whole green world spread out below. You don't have to be anywhere near that mountain to feel the height of it tonight. We've been moving through time tonight, through ancient geology, through the lives of the people who lived and worked and fought for these mountains. And all of it has happened under the canopy of the forest. It's time, I think, to look more closely at that forest, at the living, breathing, endlessly surprising world that exists inside it, because the trees and the creatures of the Smokies are their own kind of miracle, and their story is one that scientists are still, even now, just beginning to fully understand. Act 4. The Park Everyone Comes to. There are places in the world that belong in some quiet and fundamental way to everyone. Not in a legal sense, though sometimes that too, but in a deeper sense, in the sense that when you arrive there for the first time, something in you recognizes it, something settles. You feel, without being able to fully explain why, that you have a right to be here. that this place was not made for any particular kind of person or any particular level of wealth or education or experience, that it was made, or rather, that it simply is, for anyone who comes to it with open eyes and a willingness to be quiet for a little while. The Smoky Mountains are one of those places, and the numbers when you sit with them for a moment are almost hard to believe. Great Smoky Mountains National Park is the most visited national park in the United States. Not one of the most visited, the most visited. More than Yellowstone, more than the Grand Canyon, more than Yosemite. Every year, somewhere between 11 and 13 million people make their way to these mountains, more than any other national park draws, by a significant margin. And that has been true, more or less, for a very long time. Since the park was formally established in 1934, more than 500 million people have walked through it. 500 million. That number is almost too large to hold in your mind all at once, so try it this way instead. Imagine every person currently living in the United States, and then imagine that same number of people again, and then add another 150 million or so on top of that. All of them, at some point in the last 90 years, coming to these mountains, coming to stand under these trees, coming to hear these streams. Families on summer vacations pulling off the road to watch a black bear move through a meadow. Couples on their honeymoons, walking the ridge trails in the early morning fog. Retired school teachers spending a week in a cabin near Gatlinburg, waking each morning to the sound of a creek outside the window. Children seeing a waterfall for the first time, their faces tipped back, mouths slightly open, solitary hikers disappearing into the backcountry for days at a time, eating simple food and sleeping under stars. 500 million versions of this, 500 million arrivals, 500 million moments of that particular feeling, the one you get when you turn off the main road and the mountains rise up ahead of you and something in your chest loosens just a little bit, the way it does when you come home. And here is something that makes the Smokies different from almost every other major national park in the country. It doesn't cost anything to get in. There is no entrance fee at Great Smoky Mountains National Park. No booth at the gate, no annual pass required, no moment where you have to reach for your wallet before the mountains will let you through. You simply arrive, and the park receives you. This is, historically, one of the conditions under which the park was established. When the land was being acquired in the 1920s and 1930s, a patchwork process involving the purchase of hundreds of privately held parcels funded through a combination of state money, private donations, and eventually federal support. One of the guiding principles was that the park should be accessible to everyone. The mountains of Tennessee and North Carolina had long been a place where ordinary working people lived and farmed and made their lives. The park was meant to serve those same ordinary people, not just the ones who could afford a fee, all of them. John D. Rockefeller Jr. donated $5 million toward the land acquisition, a staggering sum in that era. The school children of Tennessee donated their pennies and dimes. Families gave what they could. The park was built through an unusual kind of collective effort, and the no-fee policy is, in some ways, a reflection of that. It belongs to everyone because everyone, in some measure, helped make it. There is something quietly radical about a place of such extraordinary beauty that simply lets you in. No transaction, no gate, just the mountains and you, and the road leading into them. The rest of the world noticed, too. In 1983, the United Nations Educational, Scientific and Cultural Organization, UNESCO, designated Great Smoky Mountains National Park as a World Heritage Site. It joined a list that includes places like the Galapagos Islands, the Great Barrier Reef, Machu Picchu, and the Serengeti. Places that have been identified through careful and considered judgment as being of such outstanding universal value that their preservation matters not just to one nation, but to all of humanity. The designation recognizes the park's extraordinary biodiversity, the sheer density and variety of life packed into these ancient mountains. More tree species than in all of northern Europe, more species of salamander than anywhere else on Earth. Wildflower displays that draw botanists from across the continent, a forest ecosystem of a complexity and completeness that is genuinely rare at this scale anywhere in the temperate world. And then, 5 years later, in 1988, the park received a second international recognition, designation as an International Biosphere Reserve. Biosphere reserves are places set aside not just for protection, but for study, for the careful, long-term observation of how natural systems work when they are allowed to function with as little human interference as possible. The Smokies, with their intact ecosystems and their extraordinary biological richness, became one of the most important outdoor laboratories on the planet. Scientists come here to study things that can no longer be studied elsewhere. Old-growth forest dynamics, undisturbed stream ecologies, the movement of species across elevational gradients, the long, slow processes of a natural world doing what it has always done, largely undisturbed. The data gathered in the Smokies informs conservation efforts not just in this park, but in wild places all over the world. These mountains are older than almost anything, and they are still teaching us. Let's stay with the streams for a moment because they deserve their own quiet attention. We mentioned earlier that the park contains 2,115 miles of streams. Those cold, clear, quick-moving waterways threading through every valley and hollow, dropping over ledges into pools, braiding across wide rocky beds, disappearing into rhododendron tunnels, so dense and dark they feel like caves. Those streams are, in many ways, the park's circulatory system, carrying water from the high ridges down through the forest and out into the rivers below, carrying nutrients, carrying the eggs of fish and salamanders and insects, connecting the high places to the low places in one long, continuous, living flow. For most of the park's history, access to those streams for fishing was restricted. Some areas were off-limits, certain tributaries were protected entirely, set aside for the recovery of native brook trout populations that had been pushed out of much of their historic range by logging, by the introduction of non-native species, by the alteration of stream habitats. The restrictions were careful and intentional, the kind of patient, long-term management that prioritizes the health of the ecosystem over short-term convenience. And the patience paid off. In 2017, for the first time since the park was established, all 2,115 miles of park streams were opened to fishing simultaneously. Every last mile of them. It was a milestone that park managers and conservation biologists had been working toward for decades, a moment that said, quietly but clearly, that the streams had recovered enough, that the native brook trout had come back far enough, that the ecosystem was healthy enough to absorb the presence of careful, regulated fishing across its full extent. It was not a dramatic announcement, it didn't make headlines outside of fishing and conservation circles. But for the people who understood what it meant, who knew the decades of work and patience and careful stewardship behind it, it was extraordinary. 2,115 miles of cold mountain water, every one of them alive and well and open. There is a particular kind of satisfaction in a story that goes the right way, in a place that was threatened and then protected, in a species that came back, in a stream that healed. These stories are rarer than they should be, and we should let ourselves feel the full weight of them when they arrive. The Smokies are in so many ways a place where things went right, where people argued and fought and gave their money and their time and their labor to preserve something that could very easily have been lost, and where the thing that was preserved turned out to be more valuable, more complex, more alive, more deeply extraordinary than even its most passionate defenders fully understood at the time. 500 million people have come here, no fee collected, the whole world watching, the streams running clear all the way to the last mile. Let that settle with you now. Let it drift down into wherever you're keeping tonight's quieter thoughts. The fire is still burning low. The night is still and soft around it. And somewhere out there, beyond the light of any fire, the mountains hold their shape against the dark sky, the same shape they've held for 200 million years, give or take. 500 million people have come to look at them, and the mountains have received everyone. But as extraordinary as the human story of the Smokies is, the visitors, the history, the protection, the healing streams, the wildest and most surprising stories here belong to the creatures. Because the Smokies are alive in a way that will catch you off guard, even if you've been told to expect it. Bears that move through the forest with the unhurried confidence of something that has belonged here far longer than we have. Elk calling across misty meadows in the early morning, salamanders under every streamside rock. And on certain warm summer nights, along certain creek bottoms, one of the most quietly magical light shows anywhere in the world. That's where we're going next. Act 5, a living world and a fragile one. There is a game that naturalists sometimes play in places like this called the all-taxa biodiversity inventory. The idea is simple in concept, if staggering in execution. You try to document every living species in a given area, every plant, every insect, every fungus, every microscopic organism in the soil and the water and the bark of the trees. Everything. The Smokies launched one of the most ambitious versions of this project ever attempted, beginning in 1998. Teams of scientists, taxonomists and ecologists and microbiologists and entomologists and dozens of other kinds of specialists have been coming to the park ever since, systematically working through the living inventory of this place, cataloguing what is here. So far, they have documented more than 10,000 species, and the estimates suggest there may be as many as 90,000 more, still unnamed, still uncounted, still living their quiet, intricate lives in the soil and the streams and the understory of the forest, waiting for someone to come along with the right equipment and the right expertise, and enough patience to sit still long enough to find them. 90,000 more. In a park that millions of people walk through every year, looking at the bears and the waterfalls and the wildflowers, entirely unaware that beneath their feet and above their heads and all around them, a world of almost incomprehensible complexity is going about its business. The Smokies are not just a beautiful place, they are one of the most biologically rich temperate ecosystems on the face of the earth. And tonight, we're going to spend a little time inside that richness, moving slowly, staying quiet, trying to see some of what is there. Start with the bears. There are approximately 1,500 black bears living in Great Smoky Mountains National Park. In a park of roughly 500,000 acres, that works out to about 2 to 3 bears per square mile, one of the highest densities of black bears anywhere in the eastern United States. They are not a rare sight here, they are residents. They have been here far longer than the park has, far longer than the settlers, far longer than anyone, except perhaps the mountains themselves. A black bear's year in the Smokies follows the rhythm of the seasons with a kind of deep, unhurried intelligence. Spring arrives and they emerge from their winter dens, the females often with cubs born during the cold months, tiny and velvet dark, following their mothers through the waking forest on unsteady legs. Through spring and summer they move across enormous home ranges, eating constantly, following the availability of food with a mental map of the landscape that would impress a seasoned hiker. Berries and insects and fish and carrion and the soft inner bark of certain trees. Whatever the season offers. By autumn, as the hard mast, the acorns and beech nuts and hickory nuts begins to fall, the bears enter a period of hyperphagia. They eat almost without stopping, sometimes consuming 20,000 calories in a single day, layering on the fat reserves that will carry them through the winter. You can find them in the fall, high up on the ridges, moving methodically through the oak forest, hoovering up acorns with a focused efficiency that is almost funny to watch in an animal that large. And then the cold comes, and they find a den, a hollow tree, a rock overhang, a depression under a fallen log, and they curl up and their world goes quiet and slow. Their heart rate drops, their temperature drops just a few degrees, they breathe perhaps once every 45 seconds, and they wait, somewhere between sleeping and waking, for the forest to call them back. There is something about the bears that gets under your skin if you spend enough time in the Smokies. They move through the same forest you move through, but they belong to it in a way you never quite will. They know it the way you know your own house in the dark, by feel, by smell, by some deep interior map that has been building since they were cubs, stumbling after their mothers through the May wildflowers. Go to the streams next, not the famous ones, not the wide photogenic cascades that appear in every guidebook. Go instead to the small ones, the ones without names on most maps, running clear and cold over clean gravel, between mossy banks, barely deep enough to wet your ankles in most places. Go there in spring or early summer when the water is high and cold from snowmelt. Find a flat rock on the bank and sit down on it very quietly and just watch. After a few minutes, you'll start to see things moving. Under that rock just below the surface, carefully, slowly, lift it just a little. There will almost certainly be a salamander. Perhaps a dusky salamander, dark and sleek, moving with the unhurried precision of something that has spent its entire evolutionary history in exactly this kind of place. Or perhaps a hellbender, if you're lucky, and in the right watershed, a creature so ancient in its lineage, so unchanged over so many millions of years, that looking at one feels faintly like looking backward through time. The Smoky Mountains are called, without exaggeration, the salamander capital of the world. Around 30 species of salamander live in the park. 30 species in an animal group that most people give very little thought to, inhabiting an extraordinary variety of niches, some entirely aquatic, some entirely terrestrial, some living their whole lives in the spray zone of waterfalls, some so small you could hold a dozen in your cupped hands, some large enough to make you catch your breath when you find them under a stream-side rock. Salamanders are, in the quiet way of things that don't announce themselves, an indicator species of rare importance. They breathe partly through their skin. They need water that is clean and cold and well oxygenated. They need stream habitats that are intact, undisturbed, connected. When salamanders are doing well, it means the streams are doing well, which means the forest feeding those streams is doing well. A healthy salamander population is a report card on the health of everything above and around it. The Smokies' salamanders are, by that measure, a very good sign. Look up from the stream, and there are birds. More than 200 species have been recorded in the park. Some of them year-round residents, living out their whole lives within the park's boundaries. Some of them migrants passing through on journeys of extraordinary length. The ruby-throated hummingbird, for instance, that tiny jewel of a creature that weighs less than a nickel and yet makes the trip from Central America to the mountains of Tennessee each spring, crossing the Gulf of Mexico in a single non-stop flight of up to 500 miles. Think about that for a moment, if you like. Something the size of your thumb, crossing the Gulf of Mexico, arriving in the Smokies in April to hover at the first red tubular flowers it can find, its wings a blur, its heart beating more than 1,000 times a minute. At the other end of the scale, the peregrine falcon, one of the fastest animals on Earth, capable of reaching speeds above 200 miles per hour in a hunting stoop, nests on the high, rocky outcrops and cliff faces of the park. It was gone from the eastern United States for decades, eliminated by the accumulation of pesticides in its food chain, its eggshells thinning until they could no longer hold the weight of an incubating parent. It came back through one of the most sustained and careful reintroduction efforts in American conservation history, and now it is here again, riding the thermals above the high ridges, folding its wings and dropping from the sky in that terrifying, beautiful plunge. 200 species. From the hummingbird threading through the rhododendron to the falcon, hanging motionless above the ridge on spread wings, reading the landscape below with eyes that can pick out a mouse from 1,000 feet up. And the trout. The brook trout, the only trout native to the southern Appalachians, the fish that was here before any other kind came, still lives in the cold, clear headwaters of the park's streams. It is a small fish, as trout go, brilliantly colored, an olive back marked with worm-like patterns, flanks flickering with pale blue halos around red spots, the leading edges of the lower fins edged in white and black. In the right light, in clear water, it is one of the most beautiful fish you will ever see. The brook trout needs cold water, very cold, ideally below 68 degrees Fahrenheit, and cooler than that for spawning. It needs clean gravel stream beds. It needs forest cover over the stream to keep the water temperature down and to provide the insect life that it feeds on. It is, like the salamander, a creature whose well-being is inseparable from the well-being of everything around it. The Smokies are one of the last places in the eastern United States where wild brook trout still exist in anything like their historic abundance. Almost everywhere else they have been pushed out by warming water, by non-native species introductions, by the loss of forest cover, by the 1,000 small insults of a landscape heavily used by people. Here, in the high, cold headwaters of the park, they persist. They are not easy to find. You have to go high and go far and go quietly. But they are there. And then, in spring and early summer, the flowers come. More than 1,600 species of flowering plants have been documented in the park. 1,600. The diversity is partly a function of the mountain's age. Plants have had an extraordinarily long time to diversify and specialize here, and partly a function of the enormous range of habitats compressed into the park's relatively compact area. From the warm, humid cove forests at lower elevations to the cold, exposed ridge lines near the summits, the park spans the equivalent of a journey from Georgia to northern Canada in terms of climate and vegetation. Each zone has its own community of plants. Each blooms in its own time. Spring in the Smokies begins early, down in the sheltered coves, and moves upward through the season as the warmth climbs the slopes. First, the hepatica, pushing up through the last of the leaf litter while there is still snow in the shadows. Then the trout lilies, then the trilliums, white and red and yellow, whole hillsides of them, then the wild geraniums and the phlox and the fire pinks, then the flame azaleas, those extraordinary burning shrubs on the high balds, the ones that stopped Harlan Kelsey in his tracks 100 years ago and started the whole chain of events that led to the park existing at all, and rare orchids in quiet corners that most visitors never find, delicate, specific, requiring exactly the right soil chemistry, the right light, the right fungal partners in the roots. Plants that could not survive anywhere but here, in these particular conditions, in this particular place. Plants that are, in a very real sense, irreplaceable. Autumn brings its own transformation. The great, slow fire of the hardwood forest, changing color, working its way down from the highest elevations as the cold comes on. The red maples first, then the sourwoods, then the oaks and tulip poplars, the whole canopy shifting from green through gold and orange and deep crimson. And up near the summits, above the line where the hardwoods give way to spruce and fir, the change is different, darker, more somber, more like the forests of the far north. But the high elevation forests are where the hardest part of tonight's story lives. The part that asks more of us than wonder. Near the summits, near Kauai, near Klingman's Dome, along the highest ridge lines, there are stands of spruce and fir that are dying, have been dying slowly and visibly for decades. The red spruce and Fraser fir that form the high elevation forest, a forest more characteristic of Canada than of Tennessee. A community of trees that survived here through the ice ages and clung to the mountain tops as the climate warmed around them, are under pressure from two directions at once. The first is the balsam woolly adelgid, a tiny invasive insect accidentally introduced from Europe decades ago that attacks Fraser fir specifically, boring into the bark and disrupting the tree's ability to transport water and nutrients. An infested fir can be dead within a few years. The high elevation forests have lost enormous numbers of Fraser fir to this insect, and the standing dead trees, silvery grey against the sky, still upright but long since drained of life, are a visible and persistent reminder of what an introduced pest can do to a specialized, vulnerable ecosystem. The second pressure is less visible but in some ways more troubling: the slow, cumulative effect of air pollution and climate change. Acid deposition from industrial emissions to the west has altered the chemistry of the soil and the water in the high elevations, stripping nutrients, stressing trees that are already living at the edge of their thermal tolerance. And the warming climate is pushing that edge higher. The zone where spruce and fir can survive is shrinking, creeping upward year by year. There is only so far up a mountain you can go before you run out of mountain. The park's scientists are working on it. There are breeding programs for Fraser fir that show some promise. There are efforts to protect the most vulnerable stands. There is careful, sustained attention being paid to what is happening up there on those cold, cloud-wrapped ridges. But it is slow work against forces that are large and complicated and not entirely within anyone's control. The high forest asks us to hold two things at once: the wonder of a place so extraordinary that it shelters species found nowhere else on Earth, and the grief of knowing that the sheltering is not complete, that the same forces of human carelessness that once stripped these mountains of their trees are now working on them from a different direction, more quietly, harder to see, harder to stop. It is not a comfortable thing to carry, but it is an honest one. 10,000 documented species and perhaps 90,000 more living their lives in the leaf litter and the cold streams and the high, cold air above the tree line. Bears following their ancient seasonal rhythms, salamanders under every streamside stone. A brook trout, holding in the current of a headwater stream no wider than a country road. 1,600 kinds of flowers working their way up the mountainside through spring, each one in its own time, its own place, its own particular arrangement of petal and colour and scent. And up near the summit, the fir trees standing grey and still against the sky, asking nothing of us except that we pay attention. Let all of it rest with you now. The living and the fragile and the enduring and the threatened, all of it held together in those old, patient mountains. The fire is burning lower. The night has settled fully in. We've moved through a lot of country tonight, through deep time and human history, through the era of the axe and the railroad, and the slow return of the green. Through the lives of bears and salamanders and trout and 200 kinds of birds. Through flowers and high, cold forests and the quiet grief of things under pressure. There is one last kind of wonder waiting for us, though, and it arrives, as the best things often do, at night. Some of it glows, some of it sounds like water over stone. Some of it is a sky so full of stars that people drive hours just to stand under it. The Smokies after dark are a different place entirely, and that's where we'll spend the last stretch of our evening together. Act 6. Smoky Magic, Moments and Hidden Corners. There is a particular kind of magic that only arrives after dark. Not the dramatic kind, not thunder and lightning and the mountains lit up in sudden white. The quiet kind. The kind that has always been there, going about its business whether anyone notices or not. That simply becomes visible once the noise of the day fades away, and your eyes adjust, and you remember how to be still. The Smokies have always been a place of that quieter magic. The Cherokee knew it. The mountain families who told their stories by firelight knew it. The lookout in the tower on camera, watching the stars wheel overhead from 5,000 feet, knew it. The botanist on the bald, stopped cold by the sight of all those burning flowers, knew it in a different way, but knew it just the same. Tonight, in this last stretch of our time together, we're going to visit a few of the places in these mountains where that quality is most concentrated, where the boundary between the ordinary world and something else entirely feels, if only for a moment, just a little thinner than usual. Come quietly. We don't want to disturb anything. Late May arrives in the Smokies with the smell of wild honeysuckle and the sound of the creek running fast with the last of the spring melt and the rhododendrons just beginning to think about opening. The days are long and warm and the forest canopy has closed back in overhead, that particular deep green of early summer that makes every shaft of light look like it's been filtered through emerald. And on certain nights, warm nights, humid nights, the kind of nights when the air itself seems to be breathing, something happens in the forest around Elkmont that has no real parallel anywhere in the eastern United States. The fireflies begin. Fireflies are, of course, familiar to anyone who grew up in the eastern half of this country. The blinking lights drifting through summer backyards on July evenings, the kind you chase as a child, with a jar and a lid with holes punched in it. They are a common, beloved, taken for granted piece of summer. But the fireflies of Elkmont, a species called Photinus carolinus, do something that most firefly species in the world do not do. They synchronize. For roughly 2 weeks each year, somewhere in the window between late May and early June, the male fireflies of this species begin to flash in unison. Not approximately together, not kind of at the same time. In unison, the whole forest, thousands upon thousands of individual fireflies spread across the slopes and hollows around Elkmont, pulses with light all together, and then goes dark all together, and then pulses again. 6 flashes, sometimes more, in rapid sequence, then darkness, then the whole display again. It looks to the human eye like the forest itself is breathing light, like something vast and ancient is sending a message in a language just beyond understanding. People who see it for the first time often go very quiet. Some of them cry, though they might have difficulty explaining exactly why. There is something about the scale of it, the sheer number of individual living things moving in such perfect, unexplained coordination that reaches past the rational mind and touches something older. Scientists understand the mechanism, more or less. It's a mating display, the males advertising their fitness to the females waiting in the vegetation below. The synchrony emerging from a kind of biological entrainment, each firefly adjusting its timing in response to the flashes around it until the whole population locks into the same rhythm. The mechanism is understood, but understanding the mechanism doesn't diminish the experience by a single flicker. The Park Service now manages access to the Elkmont synchronous firefly display through a lottery system. The popularity of the event has grown to the point where unmanaged crowds would trample the very habitat that makes it possible. Each year, tens of thousands of people enter the lottery for a relatively small number of shuttle passes. The lucky ones ride out to Elkmont after dark, surrender their flashlights, and stand in the dark forest while the light show happens around them. No phones, no bright lights, just the dark and the trees and the fireflies doing what they have done every late May for longer than anyone can trace, for reasons that have nothing to do with us at all. We just get to watch. Not far from Elkmont, along the little river trail, there is a bridge. It is not a grand bridge. It is not a famous bridge. It does not appear in the major guidebooks, and most of the people who cross it are focused on the trail ahead rather than on the structure beneath their feet, which is perhaps why it has managed to keep its particular quality of enchantment intact, despite the number of boots that pass over it each year. It is a mossy stone bridge, low and arched and old, crossing the little river at a point where the water runs clear and quick over smooth, rounded boulders. The stones of the bridge are covered in a deep, soft moss of a green, so vivid it almost doesn't look real. The river sounds close below. On either side, the forest presses in, rhododendron and hemlock, the kind of dense, shaded, dripping wet forest that makes you feel as though you've wandered into somewhere that exists slightly outside of ordinary geography. People call it the Troll Bridge, and you can see why immediately if you approach it on a cool, misty morning when the light is diffuse and the sound of the river fills the air, and the moss on the stones is still wet with overnight dew. It looks like something out of a story, like something that was placed here specifically by someone or something that understood exactly what a bridge ought to look like if it wanted to be memorable. There are no trolls, of course, probably, but the bridge has that quality that certain old, mossy, well-placed structures in forests sometimes have. The quality of making you feel that the world is slightly larger and stranger and more richly storied than it appeared to be 5 minutes ago. That there are more layers to things than the ones you usually see. Cross it slowly. If you ever get the chance, run your hand along the mossy stone railing. Listen to the river below. Give the moment the attention it deserves. A little further afield, 4.5 miles along the Twin Creeks Trail from Gatlinburg, deep enough into the forest that the town behind you has entirely disappeared, replaced by bird sound and stream sound and the soft percussion of your own footsteps on the trail, there is a place that has come to be known, among those who know about it at all, as the House of the Fairies. It is, in the plain description of things, an old spring house, a small stone structure built in the 19th century on what was once the Voorhuis estate, designed to keep perishable food cool, using the constant cold temperature of a natural spring. These were practical buildings built for entirely practical reasons by practical mountain people who had no particular interest in enchantment. Keep the milk cold, keep the butter from going soft, keep the things that spoil from spoiling, but time and the forest have transformed it into something quite different from what it was built to be. The stone walls are covered now in a tapestry of mosses and ferns and small flowering plants that have colonized every available surface over the course of more than a century. The spring still runs, trickling over and around the old stones, keeping everything around it perpetually cool and damp. The light in that part of the forest comes down soft and green through the canopy, and it falls on the little stone building at an angle that seems specifically designed to make it look like something out of a picture book. The name arrived naturally, the way the best names always do. Someone came here and saw it and said the thing that was true. It looks like somewhere that small, careful, ancient beings might live. It looks like a place that has been tended by something that is not quite human. The moss is too evenly distributed, the ferns too deliberately placed, the whole composition too perfect to have happened by pure accident. Of course it did happen by pure accident, or rather by the slow, patient, impersonal process of ecology doing what ecology does, water and light and spore and root working out their arrangements without any intention behind them. And yet, you can believe in the ecological explanation completely and still feel standing in front of the House of the Fairies on a cool morning with the spring running and the ferns trembling slightly in no apparent breeze, that there is something more to it than the explanation accounts for, that some places are simply charged, alive with something that doesn't have a scientific name and doesn't need one. The 4.5 miles to get there keeps it quiet. Keep it that way if you go. And then there is Midnight Hole. The name alone earns attention. Midnight Hole. It sounds like somewhere a story would happen, somewhere a secret would be kept. It is, in the geography of the park, a deep swimming hole on Big Creek in the northeastern corner of the park. A corner that sees significantly fewer visitors than the more famous areas near Gatlinburg and Cherokee. A corner where the pace is slower and the forest is denser, and the trail along Big Creek feels, on a weekday in early fall, like something close to genuine solitude. Big Creek runs cold and clear over a bed of pale boulders, and in one particular place the creek drops over a ledge into a pool that is deep enough and dark enough in its depths to deserve the name it carries. The water is the color of tea over the dark gravel bottom. Above the pool, Mouse Creek Falls comes in from the side, a secondary waterfall joining the main creek in a white rush that fills the air with mist and sound. On a warm day in late summer, when the park's more famous swimming holes are crowded 3 deep, Midnight Hole is likely to have only a handful of people at it, if that. People who made the effort. People who chose the longer trail and the quieter corner, people who know by instinct or by experience that the best things in a place like this are rarely the things at the end of the shortest path. The water is cold, mountain stream cold, the kind that takes your breath when you first go in and then, after a minute, feels like the best thing that has ever happened to you. The kind that makes the warm air afterward feel like a gift. You float on your back in the dark, clear water of Midnight Hole, and the trees are overhead, and the falls are sounding in your left ear, and the creek is moving around you, and the sky above the canopy is very blue and very far away. If you are very still and very lucky, a kingfisher might come through. That small, electric blue missile of a bird, rattling its territorial call as it shoots low over the water, gone before you've fully registered that it was there, or nothing will come through. And that will be exactly right too. So here we are. We started tonight on the deep geological time of these ancient mountains, stone that was once a seafloor, ridges worn smooth over 200 million years, the rain feeding into 2,000 miles of streams, and everything growing green from all of it. We moved through the lives of the people who called this place home. The Cherokee, for whom it was a homeland woven with meaning. The settlers who built their mills and barns and churches in the coves. The loggers who stripped the slopes bare. And the people who looked at what remained and decided it was worth every effort to save. We walked through the park that grew from all of that effort, the most visited in the country, free to everyone, recognized by the whole world as something of irreplaceable value. We moved among its creatures, bears following their ancient seasonal map, salamanders in every cold stream, brook trout holding in headwater pools that are among the last of their kind in the eastern United States. We stood in the spring wildflowers and watched the high elevation forest on the ridge lines and held the grief of what is under pressure alongside the wonder of what remains. And then we came here to the quiet corners, the fireflies blinking in unison in the dark forest, the mossy bridge over the clear river, the fairy springhouse deep in the Twin Creeks forest, the cold, dark water of Midnight Hole with the falls sounding and the kingfisher gone in a blue flash before you could be sure you really saw it. The Smokies are all of this at once, the ancient and the fragile, the crowded and the solitary, the well-documented and the still mysterious, the wild creatures and the human stories, and the 200 million year patience of the stone beneath everything. And tonight, for this little stretch of time, they have been yours. The fire has burned down to coals now, just a low orange glow, warm enough to sit beside, quiet enough to think in. The mountains are still out there in the dark, exactly where they have always been, doing what they have always done. The bears are in their dens or moving through the night forest on errands we will never know about. The streams are running. The fireflies, in their season, are waiting. The Smokies are patient. They have been waiting for a very long time. And they will be waiting still when you wake up tomorrow, and the day after that, and every day beyond it for longer than any of us can usefully imagine. For now, though, there is nothing you need to do, nowhere you need to go, nothing you need to understand or remember or hold on to. Just let the mountains be there, in the dark, behind your closed eyes, blue ridges fading one behind the other into the haze, cold water over smooth stone, the smell of rain in old forest. Something small and brilliant blinking in the darkness under the trees, once, twice again, and then the dark and the quiet and the night settling in around everything like a blanket pulled up close. Sleep well. The mountains will keep watch.